The cemetery stretched across a quiet hill on the outskirts of town, a patchwork of moss-covered headstones and leaning crosses. Each morning, Evelyn Porter walked its winding paths, her arms laden with fresh flowers. At 72, Evelyn found solace in her daily ritual. She believed the dead deserved to be remembered, even if no one else thought so. The townspeople often whispered about her. "She's obsessed with that graveyard," they'd say, shaking their heads. But Evelyn paid them no mind. She felt a strange kinship with the cemetery's silence. Here, under the shade of ancient oaks, she could listen to the rustling leaves and hear the faint echoes of lives once lived. Evelyn's focus was on the neglected graves, those whose families had long since moved away or forgotten their duty. She knew each plot by heart. The Smith child who died of fever, the old shoemaker with no family, the unnamed pauper buried under a cracked slab. Every grave told a story, and Evelyn was their sole witness. One gray morning, as she bent to lay a bouquet of lilies on the Smith child's grave, something peculiar caught her eye. The flowers she had left the day before were wilted, their petals shriveled and brown. Evelyn frowned. It wasn't unusual for flowers to fade, but not this quickly. She touched the stems. They felt dry as dust. Puzzled, she replaced the lilies and moved on. But at another grave, she found the same thing, and then another. By the time she reached the cemetery's far corner, unease prickled at the back of her neck. "Perhaps the weather's to blame," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. But deep down, she felt it wasn't that simple. The air seemed heavier here, as if the cemetery itself was holding its breath. Evelyn glanced around, her heart beating a little faster. For the first time, the silence felt less like a comfort and more like a warning. Unsettled, she gathered her tools and left, but not without a lingering sense that someone was watching. Evelyn returned to the cemetery the next day, her arms once again filled with fresh flowers. Yet, as she walked the familiar paths, the unsettling feeling from the previous morning lingered. The air seemed heavier, the silence deeper, as if the cemetery itself was waiting for her. She knelt by the Smith child's grave, only to find the new lilies from the day before already wilting. Her breath hitched. This time, the stems were brittle, the petals crumbling to dust at her touch. A shiver ran down her spine. Moving quickly, Evelyn checked the other graves. Again, the flowers she had placed were dead. Far too soon, she whispered to herself, trying to rationalize the phenomenon. "Perhaps the soil is bad or the water," she said, though the explanation felt hollow. As she stood, a faint sound broke the stillness, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the wind. Evelyn froze, straining her ears. It was not the rustle of leaves nor the chirp of birds. It was voices, low, murmuring voices, indistinct but undeniably present. She spun around, her eyes scanning the rows of tombstones. But no one was there. The cemetery was as empty as ever. Yet, the whispers persisted, growing louder the longer she stood still. They seemed to beckon her, urging her deeper into the heart of the graveyard. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "It's just the wind," she said aloud, her voice trembling. Still, her feet carried her forward, drawn inexplicably toward the sound. By the time she reached the farthest corner of the cemetery, the whispers had stopped. The air was deathly still again, but Evelyn could not shake the feeling that she was no longer alone. That night, sleep eluded Evelyn. Her mind kept returning to the whispers and the decaying flowers. There was something deeply wrong with the cemetery, something she couldn't explain. Determined to find answers, she decided to investigate. The next morning, instead of bringing her usual bouquets, Evelyn visited the town library. The librarian, Mrs. Harris, greeted her with a curious look. "Looking for something specific, Evelyn?" "Yes," Evelyn said, her voice resolute. "I need records of the people buried in the cemetery, especially the older graves, the ones that seemed forgotten." Mrs. Harris hesitated but led Evelyn to a dusty archive filled with brittle newspapers and faded ledgers. Hours passed as Evelyn pored over the records, and slowly, a pattern emerged. Many of the neglected graves belonged to people who had died under tragic or mysterious circumstances. There was the Smith child, who succumbed to a fever in the dead of winter, the shoemaker, who had died alone and penniless, and an unnamed woman whose body was found at the edge of town, her identity forever a mystery. Their lives were marked by loneliness, abandonment, and ultimately oblivion. Evelyn's heart ached as she read their stories. These weren't just names on headstones. They were people, forgotten by time and left without anyone to remember their pain. As she closed the final ledger, a thought struck her. Perhaps the dead were not content to be remembered in silence. Perhaps they demanded something more. That evening, she returned to the cemetery with renewed purpose. She had thought her flowers were enough, but now she wondered if the restless souls needed more than simple offerings. The whispers returned the moment Evelyn stepped into the cemetery. They were clearer now, urgent and insistent, guiding her toward a shadowed corner she rarely visited. Clutching her flashlight, Evelyn followed the sound, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into words she could almost understand. They seemed to chant a name she didn't recognize. Finally, she reached the end of the path, where an unmarked grave lay beneath a gnarled oak tree. The air here was colder, the ground damp and heavy. Evelyn's heart pounded as she knelt by the grave, brushing away the fallen leaves that covered its surface. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. Silence descended, oppressive and suffocating. Evelyn could feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on her. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the earth beneath her hands began to shift. Slowly, a ghostly figure emerged from the ground, a pale, translucent form with hollow eyes and an expression of deep sorrow. "You bring flowers," the spirit said, its voice a hollow echo. "But flowers are not enough." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" The spirit's gaze bore into hers. "We are forgotten. Our stories untold. We linger, unseen and unheard. You must remember us." Evelyn felt a cold dread settle in her chest. The spirit raised a hand, pointing toward the cemetery's many graves. "Tell our stories, or you, too, will be forgotten. Your flowers will wilt, and your name will vanish from memory." The figure dissolved, leaving Evelyn alone in the darkness. She rose slowly, her resolve hardening. She knew what she had to do. Evelyn devoted herself to the task the spirits had demanded. Each day, she returned to the cemetery, not with flowers but with a notebook and pen. She spent hours documenting the names and stories of the forgotten, piecing together their lives from old records and whispered clues. She began writing articles for the local newspaper, sharing the tales of the cemetery's long-forgotten residents. The townspeople were intrigued at first, then deeply moved. They began visiting the graves themselves, bringing flowers, prayers, and a newfound respect for those who had once been invisible. As Evelyn's work progressed, the cemetery itself seemed to change. The oppressive heaviness lifted, and the whispers grew softer, more like gentle murmurs of gratitude. The flowers she placed on the graves now thrived, their vibrant colors standing in stark contrast to the dull gray stones. But with every story Evelyn told, she felt the weight of their sorrow. The pain of their forgotten lives lingered in her heart, a constant reminder of the fragile line between memory and oblivion. Despite the emotional toll, Evelyn pressed on. She knew she was giving the dead what they craved most, to be remembered, to be seen. Yet, in the quiet moments, when she sat alone among the tombstones, she couldn't shake the feeling that her work was far from over. There were still whispers in the wind, faint and fleeting, as if some souls remained waiting for their turn to be heard. Years passed, and Evelyn's work became a cornerstone of the town's history. The cemetery, once a place of eerie silence, was now a sanctuary of memory and reverence. Visitors came often, not just to mourn but to connect with the past. Evelyn, now frail but content, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had spent her final years ensuring that the forgotten were remembered. Yet, As she walked the familiar paths one crisp autumn evening, a familiar sensation prickled at the back of her neck. She paused by the unmarked grave under the oak tree, now marked with a simple stone that read, "Unknown, but not forgotten." Evelyn smiled softly. Just as she turned to leave, a faint whisper reached her ears. "Thank you," it said, barely audible, carried on the wind. Evelyn closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. But as she walked away, the wind shifted, carrying a different whisper. It was faint but unmistakable. "Don't forget us." Evelyn stopped, her heart heavy once more. She knew then that her mission would never truly end. For every story told, there were always more waiting, lingering on the edges of memory, yearning for their moment in the light. As she left the cemetery that night, a new visitor entered, a young man carrying a bouquet of fresh flowers. Evelyn watched from a distance, a bittersweet smile on her face. Her work had inspired others, ensuring that the cycle of remembrance would continue. But in the back of her mind, she knew the cemetery's whispers would never truly be silenced. The sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows over the town's ancient cemetery. Henry Graves stood at the wrought iron gates, his breath misting in the cool evening air. The cemetery stretched before him, a labyrinth of weathered tombstones and crumbling mausoleums. This was where Henry felt most alive, surrounded by the relics of the dead. For years, he had combed the graves for artifacts, tarnished trinkets, cracked urns, and, most importantly, bones. Each find was a treasure, a piece of history he could hold in his hands. His collection filled shelves and cabinets in his dimly lit home, each item meticulously labeled. To Henry, bones were more than remnants. They were conduits to the past, imbued with power and mystery. This evening, he wandered deeper into the cemetery than usual. His lantern's flickering light danced across the tombstones as he scanned the ground for anything unusual. Finally, near the base of an ancient oak tree, his eyes caught a faint glimmer. Henry knelt, brushing aside the dirt to reveal a femur bone, its surface intricately carved with symbols. The markings were unfamiliar, a mix of geometric shapes and flowing lines. His pulse quickened. This was no ordinary find. It was something special. He carefully placed the bone in his satchel, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. As he rose, the air around him seemed to shift, growing heavier. The distant sound of rustling leaves carried an unnatural edge, like whispers just beyond hearing. Henry glanced around but saw nothing unusual. "Just the wind," he muttered, gripping the satchel tightly. Yet, as he made his way out of the cemetery, a lingering unease settled over him, as though unseen eyes were watching his every move. Back home, Henry placed the carved femur bone on his workbench, its strange symbols gleaming under the yellow glow of his desk lamp. He traced his fingers along the intricate lines, marveling at their craftsmanship. Whatever culture had created this, it must have been ancient and deeply spiritual. Yet, as the hours passed, an unsettling feeling crept in. The room, usually a haven for Henry's obsessions, felt colder, as though the warmth had been siphoned away. He tried to shake the sensation, chalking it up to fatigue. But then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs barely audible over the creak of his chair. He glanced around, certain he was alone, but the whispers persisted, growing louder. The words were foreign, their meaning lost, but their tone carried a sense of urgency and anger. Henry stood abruptly, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" he demanded, but only silence answered. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, stretching toward him. Objects on his shelves, a cracked skull, a collection of rib bones, seemed to vibrate slightly, as though reacting to an unseen force. Sweat beaded on Henry's forehead. He considered putting the femur bone back in his satchel, but his pride held him back. This was his most unique find yet, a cornerstone for his collection. He couldn't just abandon it. That night, the whispers followed him to bed. They circled his thoughts, invading his dreams. Faceless figures surrounded him in the darkness, their skeletal hands reaching, their hollow voices chanting. By morning, Henry awoke feeling drained, but his resolve was intact. He would uncover the bone's secrets, no matter the cost. The nightmares intensified with each passing night. Henry found himself trapped in an endless cemetery, the graves yawning open to reveal skeletal figures with glowing, hollow eyes. They reached for him, their bony fingers clawing at his skin as they whispered in an ancient tongue. Desperate for answers, Henry pored over books and online forums, seeking any clue about the bone's origins. His search led him to a name, ritual symbols of the forgotten cultures. The town library had a copy, and Henry wasted no time in retrieving it. The book's brittle pages detailed burial rites from obscure civilizations. One chapter caught his attention, a burial ritual designed to trap vengeful spirits. The symbols on the bone matched perfectly. The ritual, the book explained, was used to seal away those who had died under violent or unjust circumstances, their anger too great to allow peaceful rest. Henry's hands trembled as he read. The unmarked grave he had disturbed wasn't a mere burial. It was a prison, and by taking the bone, he had set something free. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of his mistake sinking in. Yet, even now, the thought of returning the bone felt unbearable. It was the centerpiece of his collection, a once-in-a-lifetime find. But the whispers wouldn't let him rest. That night, the spirit in his dreams grew more aggressive, its skeletal face inches from his own. "Return what you've stolen," it hissed, its voice echoing through the dark. Henry jolted awake, gasping for breath. The bone's carved symbols seemed to glow faintly in the dark, as if mocking him. The next night, Henry sat in his dimly lit living room, the femur bone resting on the coffee table before him. The whispers were louder now, filling every corner of the house. Henry had grown accustomed to the shadows, shifting in his peripheral vision, but tonight felt different. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath came out in visible puffs, and the whispers coalesced into a single, chilling voice. "Henry Graves," it called, low and menacing. Henry shot to his feet, eyes darting around the room. From the darkness, a figure emerged, a skeletal apparition draped in tattered burial shrouds. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and its bony fingers pointed accusingly at him. "You have disturbed my rest," the spirit intoned. "You desecrate the sacred with your greed." Henry's knees buckled, but he managed to steady himself. "I didn't know," he stammered. "I meant no harm." The spirit's jaw opened in a ghastly grin. "Ignorance does not absolve you. Return the bone, or suffer as I have suffered." Henry's hands trembled. I can't. It's part of my collection. It's too important." The spirit loomed closer, its skeletal form towering over him. "If you keep what is not yours, you will join me in eternal torment. The choice is yours." With that, the spirit vanished, leaving Henry alone in the freezing room. His mind raced. The warning was clear, but his obsession kept him anchored. He couldn't give up the bone. Not yet. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. The spirit's presence became inescapable, its skeletal form appearing in every reflective surface. Henry stopped sleeping, afraid of the relentless nightmares that awaited him. The once comforting silence of his home was now filled with constant, low whispers. They echoed through his thoughts, even when he tried to focus on other tasks. His collection, once a source of pride, now felt like a curse. Paranoia consumed him. He rarely left the house, fearing that others might sense his secret or, worse, try to take the bone from him. His physical health deteriorated, his face gaunt, eyes sunken. One evening, as he sat surrounded by his relics, the whispers grew deafening. The spirit materialized again, this time more forcefully. "Return what you've taken, or your soul will rot," it hissed. Henry clutched his head, the weight of his obsession battling against his fear. He was teetering on the edge of madness, yet part of him still resisted letting go of the bone. It was his greatest find, after all. Henry could take no more. On a cold, moonless night, he wrapped the femur bone in a cloth and made his way back to the cemetery. The whispers followed him, urging him forward. The cemetery was shrouded in darkness, the gravestones barely visible under the dim light of his lantern. He retraced his steps to the unmarked grave beneath the ancient oak tree. As he knelt to return the bone, the spirit appeared once more. Its skeletal face hovered above him, its eyes burning with malevolent light. "You are late," it said, its voice filled with rage. "I'm returning it," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. He placed the bone back in the grave and began to cover it with dirt. The spirit's form flickered, its hollow eyes fixed on him. "Know this," it said. "Disturb the dead again, and you will join them." With that, the spirit faded, the oppressive air lifting slightly. Henry slumped to the ground, exhausted but relieved. The whispers had ceased, and the cemetery was silent once more. Weeks passed, and Henry tried to move on. The whispers no longer haunted him, and his nights were free of nightmares. Yet a hollow feeling remained. His collection felt incomplete without the carved femur bone. One day, he found himself drawn back to the cemetery, walking its familiar paths. It was peaceful now, the air lighter. As he passed the ancient mausoleum, something caught his eye, a small bone fragment, partially buried in the dirt. Henry froze, his heart pounding. He knelt slowly, brushing the dirt away to reveal the fragment. It was nothing remarkable, just a piece of a rib bone. Yet, his hand trembled as he reached for it. The spirit's warning echoed in his mind. "Disturb the dead again, and you will join them." Henry hesitated, his old obsession battling with his newfound fear. The temptation was strong, but so was the memory of the spirit's wrath. The chapter ends with Henry's hand hovering over the bone, leaving the reader to wonder whether he has truly learned his lesson. The small town of Millhaven was quiet, almost too quiet for Claire's liking. As a newcomer, she found its silence unnerving, but it was the cemetery at the edge of town that truly unsettled her. The locals avoided it, especially the section with the tiny graves. "That's where the lost children rest," an elderly shopkeeper had whispered when Claire asked about it. "Best to leave them be." Naturally, Claire's curiosity only deepened. One cloudy afternoon, she ventured to the cemetery. It was larger than she expected, with rows of moss-covered headstones stretching into the distance. The air was cool and carried a faint scent of damp earth. As she walked deeper, she found the children's section, a secluded corner marked by small headstones, each etched with a handprint. The sight struck her with a wave of sadness. Most of the graves were unmarked, and those that bore names were weathered beyond legibility. Claire knelt beside one of the graves, her fingers tracing the tiny handprint. "Who were you?" she whispered. As she lingered, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves. Then she heard it, soft giggles, faint but distinct. Claire froze, her pulse quickening. She scanned the area, but saw nothing unusual, just rows of silent graves. Shaking off the feeling, she stood and prepared to leave, but the giggles came again, followed by the sound of tiny footsteps darting behind the gravestones. Claire's heart raced. She turned sharply, expecting to see a child, but there was no one there. The cemetery grew still again, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The air felt heavier now, filled with a quiet, watchful presence. Uneasy but intrigued, she left, determined to return and uncover the truth behind the lost children. The first night after her visit to the cemetery, Claire slept fitfully. She woke to the faint sound of tapping on her bedroom window. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the rhythm was too deliberate. She hesitated before pulling back the curtain, her heart pounding. There was nothing but the shadowy outline of the tree outside swaying in the breeze. The next morning, as she sipped her coffee, Claire's eyes drifted to the window. Her mug froze mid-air. There on the glass were tiny handprints, smudged and faint but unmistakably small, like those of a child. A chill ran down her spine. Claire shook her head, trying to rationalize it. "It's just dirt," she muttered, wiping the prints away. But the unease stayed with her. That evening, as she worked on her lesson plans, she heard it again, faint giggles echoing from somewhere inside the house. She stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No answer, only silence, thick and heavy, settling around her. She walked through the house, turning on every light, but found nothing out of place. As the days passed, the occurrences became more frequent. Soft whispers filled the air at odd hours, and Claire often caught fleeting shadows in her peripheral vision. She even began finding small objects, like her keys and pens, moved from where she had left them. Despite her fear, Claire felt a strange pull toward the children's section of the cemetery. The whispers seemed to be calling her back, urging her to uncover something long forgotten. Her rational mind resisted, but deep down, she knew she couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Determined to find answers, Claire visited the town library. It was a small, dusty building, but the archives held a wealth of information about Millhaven's past. She approached the librarian, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes. "I'm looking for information about the children buried in the cemetery," Claire said. The librarian's face darkened. "Ah, the lost children," she murmured. "A tragic chapter in our town's history." She led Claire to a quiet corner where stacks of old newspapers and town records were kept. Hours passed as Claire sifted through the fragile pages. Finally, she found what she was looking for: articles about a fire that had destroyed the Millhaven orphanage decades ago. Many children had perished, their bodies unclaimed and buried in the cemetery's isolated section. But as she read further, Claire uncovered darker details. The orphanage had been poorly run, with reports of neglect and abuse. Some children had gone missing even before the fire, their disappearances never explained. It seemed the town had buried not only their bodies, but the truth of their suffering. Claire's heart ached for the lost children. They had been abandoned in life and forgotten in death. As she closed the final ledger, she felt a deep resolve. "These children deserve more," she whispered to herself. Armed with newfound knowledge, Claire left the library. The whispers and giggles that had once unnerved her now felt like calls for help. She knew she had to return to the cemetery, not just as a visitor, but as someone ready to face the truth. That night, Claire's sleep was anything but peaceful. Her dreams were vivid and haunting. She found herself standing in front of a large, imposing building, the Millhaven Orphanage. Its windows were shattered, and flames licked at its crumbling walls. Inside, she could hear the cries of children, mingled with the crackling of fire. She tried to run toward the sound, but her feet felt as though they were rooted to the ground. Suddenly, the front door burst open, and small, shadowy figures poured out. Their faces were obscured, but their hands reached out toward her, silently pleading. Claire jolted awake, her heart racing. Sweat clung to her skin, and for a moment, she thought she could still smell smoke. As she sat up, she noticed something strange. New handprints on the wall opposite her bed. They were faint but unmistakably similar to the ones on her window. The next night, the dreams returned. This time, Claire saw the children in the cemetery, gathered around their tiny gravestones. They were silent, but their eyes, empty and sorrowful, spoke volumes. They pointed toward the far corner of the cemetery, where the shadows seemed to grow darker. When she awoke, Claire felt a clear sense of purpose. The children were guiding her, showing her the way. With each dream, the messages became clearer, and Claire began to piece together the tragic puzzle of their lives. The visions felt like memories, urging her to confront the full weight of their pain. She knew she couldn't ignore their pleas any longer. The next evening, lantern in hand, she returned to the cemetery, ready to face the spirits of the lost children. The cemetery was eerily quiet under the pale light of the moon. Claire's footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path as she made her way toward the children's section. As she approached, the air grew colder, and the familiar sound of giggles echoed around her. This time, she wasn't afraid. She stood among the small graves, her lantern casting flickering shadows across the tombstones. "Why have you called me here?" she asked aloud, her voice steady. The wind picked up, and suddenly the shadows shifted. One by one, the spirits of the children appeared, their forms translucent and glowing faintly. They gathered around Claire, their expressions a mix of sorrow and hope. One child, a boy with hollow eyes and a tattered shirt, stepped forward. He reached out, his small hand hovering inches from Claire's. "Help us," he whispered, his voice soft but filled with pain. The other children nodded, their silent gazes pleading. Claire felt tears sting her eyes. She knelt, her heart breaking for them. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The boy pointed toward the dark corner of the cemetery, where an unmarked grave lay beneath a gnarled tree. Claire understood. This was the key to their release. The children's spirits guided Claire through the steps of an ancient ritual. She gathered candles, matches, and a small journal to record their names. The ritual required her to light a candle at each grave, speak the name of the child buried there, and offer a prayer for their peace. Starting with the nearest grave, Claire knelt and lit a candle. "For you, little one," she whispered, reciting the name carved into the stone. As she spoke, the air around her seemed to hum with energy. One by one, she moved through the graves, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. The spirits watched silently, their forms flickering in the candlelight. With each name she spoke, they seemed to grow lighter, their sorrow easing. Finally, she reached the unmarked grave beneath the gnarled tree. The boy's spirit stood beside her, his gaze unwavering. Claire lit the last candle and placed it at the base of the grave. "To the forgotten," she said, her voice cracking, "may you find peace." A sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, extinguishing the flames. For a moment, the world was still. Then, one by one, the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the night. The boy was the last to go. He gave Claire a small, sad smile before vanishing into the darkness. The cemetery felt different the next day. The oppressive weight that had lingered in the children's section was gone, replaced by a quiet peace. The air was lighter, and the graves no longer seemed as sorrowful. Claire returned to the cemetery to pay her respects. She walked among the graves, her heart heavy but filled with a sense of fulfillment. She had given the children the peace they deserved, and in doing so, she felt a deep connection to them. As she prepared to leave, a faint giggle echoed through the air. Claire paused, turning toward the sound. On one of the gravestones, a fresh handprint had appeared, small and delicate, as if left by a child. Claire smiled softly, her eyes misting. She knew that while the children had found peace, a part of them would always remain, watching over the cemetery and the town. With a final glance at the graves, Claire turned and walked away, her heart lighter than it had been in years.